We start with questions to the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs, Fabian Hamilton.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As this is the first departmental question since the appointment of the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I welcome the Shadow Front Bench to their place. Alongside my right honourable friend, the Member for Wigan, the Foreign Secretary is establishing a new soft power council to advise government and shape a new strategy to increase UK soft power and harness it to deliver our foreign policy objectives. Promoting all our soft power assets, including the British Council, BBC, World Service, scholarships and values, is crucial if we're to generate growth, security and global impact for the UK.
In Hamilton.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The Government's commitment to UK soft power was highlighted by the Chancellor's additional funding for the BBC World Service in the recent budget. Mr. Speaker, last week I met with Moldovan MPs who are on the front line of Russian aggression. They really valued the British Council's presence until it had to close owing to funding cuts. Does the Minister agree that it would be detrimental to Britain's place on the world stage if the British Council was forced to close more offices, particularly where British values of freedom and democracy are needed most?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary has made clear the UK is committed to supporting Moldova's democratic choice to pursue a path of freedom, independence and European integration. The FCDO provided £511 million in grant and aid funding for the 22 to 25 spending review period, and in an increasingly digital age, British Council's impact should be judged by operational rather than physical presence. The Council retains physical presence in over 100 countries. Those in other countries still access cultural engagement and teaching activities online.
Oh, let's take a new member of the backbenches, Andrew Mitchell, on his return.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I wish my right honourable friend, the new Shadow Foreign Secretary, every success in her role. And may I wish also the honourable gentleman and the entire government foreign affairs team courage and wisdom as they deal with a world more dangerous than at any time in our lifetimes. And can I remind them, when it comes to soft power and development, of the importance of the words best articulated by the former US Defence Secretary Mattis, which are these, that if you cut development spend, you have to order more ammunition.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me pay tribute to the Right Honourable Friend's long commitment to these issues. I returned last week from Pakistan, where I was first deployed when he was the Secretary of State for Development, so I know well his commitment to these issues over a long period. I agree with the sentiment of the Right Honourable Member's question. The aid budget is incredibly important. It makes a significant contribution to our national security right across the world, and we continue to work hard to ensure that our aid budget is fit for purpose and doing the job it needs to do on behalf of the UK right across the world.
And another new member to the front bench, Wendy Morton, Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whether it's the findings of the election monitors in Georgia, interference in the recent elections in Moldova, the illegal invasion of Ukraine, or the chill that's been felt from the Baltics to Bucharest, Europe today is a much more contested space. This is really the moment to pin our colours to the mast and be much more active in supporting those with Euro-Atlantic aspirations. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister, how will he build on the efforts of the last government and use our considerable soft power to be much more proactive?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to engage heavily on these issues. The Foreign Secretary was in Moldova last week. We are committed to enhancing the UK's soft power after a period of decline, and that is why the Foreign Secretary will be launching the Soft Power Council with the Right Honourable Member for Wigan in the coming weeks.
Clive Jones.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 2 and 10 together. Palestinian communities have suffered horrific violence at the hands of Israeli settlers. In October, the government sanctioned 3 outposts and 4 entities linked to violence in the West Bank. I won't speculate about future sanctions designations. That would only reduce their impact, but we continue to explore all options to take tougher action.
Clive Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Settlement expansion in the occupied Palestinian territories remains as one of the biggest barriers to peace in the Middle East. In October, the Foreign Secretary said that as long as violent extremists remain unaccountable, the UK and the international community will continue to act. So will he commit today to consider sanctions against the extremist ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the Israeli government?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, look, I was very clear that, and I have been in office, and that's why in October I targeted the Amana Group, which is a settler group which operates as a commercial construction company, and I was pleased that the US followed us in those sanctions just last week. I also was concerned about a religious school promoting violence against Jews. I sanctioned them. An NGO providing volunteers for illegal outposts. I sanctioned them. Of course, we continue to keep sanctions policy under consideration. We are very concerned with both the violence and the expansion and the rhetoric that we're hearing from members of the Israeli government.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened carefully to my right and friend's answer, and he's saying he's not going to speculate on future sanctions. But the two ministers named are encouraging settler violence. They have called for the annexation of the West Bank into Israel. So does my right friend accept that even if he won't talk about further sanctions today, he can recognise that that threat of annexation is real, and until we come out clearly and support an independent Palestinian state, then the settlers will continue with their violence in the belief eventually they can achieve the annexation they want.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I commend my right honourable friend for standing up for these issues, Mr. Speaker, and make it absolutely clear. Annexation would be illegal, and we would stand opposed to it. I want to make that fundamentally clear, and he should be assured that we will continue to speak out against both illegal violence against settlers and settler expansion.
Tom Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. International law is absolutely vital for us to build a platform for a more secure and peaceful world. So does the government recognise and support the ICC's jurisdiction, and will it cooperate fully with the court to ensure it can carry on its work without obstruction?
Yes, 100%, Mr. Speaker.
Come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask my right honourable friend about Ben-Gvir and Smotrich as well. And perhaps if I ask it a different way, we might be able to get an answer. Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton tells us that before the last general election, the Foreign Office were working up potential sanctions against these two most controversial and infamous settlers and government ministers. I appreciate that sanctions are kept under review. I wonder if he might be in a position to be able to tell us when a decision might be made about these two, or if a decision has already been made.
Foreign Secretary.
What can I say to the right honourable lady? Mr. Speaker, I think that the previous Foreign Secretary was wrong to talk about sanctions under consideration, particularly sanctions that he said was under consideration in office and then didn't do. I'm not going to get drawn on sanctions policy from this dispatch box, but I'm pleased that the honourable lady is raising these issues with such importance, and I think that all looking can see the strength of feeling in the House.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Calum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The comments last week by Finance Minister Smotrich advocating the annexation of the West Bank, together with the continuing devastation in northern Gaza, have reinforced that elements of the Israeli cabinet have no interest in a two-state solution. There is now a real and imminent risk that the extremists in the Israeli cabinet will succeed in annexing Palestinian territories before any negotiations can take place. So in light of this, does the Foreign Secretary agree that now is the time to recognise Palestine?
Foreign Secretary.
What can I say to the right honourable gentleman that yesterday at the G7 meeting in Rome, foreign ministers discussed this very same issue, and I think we were united, all of us, in condemning any suggestion of annexation. We would stand against it.
Chris Law.
Number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is determined to rebuild the UK's reputation on international development. We've announced a doubling of support for people hit by the humanitarian emergency in Sudan, as well as providing support for people in Gaza, Lebanon and other crisis situations.
Chris Law.
Mr Speaker, the Government's insistence on continuing to implement the Tories' deep and damaging cuts to the aid budget and unprecedented levels of ODA spending on in-donor refugee costs are resulting in reductions, pauses and cancellations of overseas ODA projects. I see you're shaking your head. I'm looking forward to your response. So can the Minister recognise the UK Government cannot say it's back on the global stage while these Boris Johnson-inspired policies continue to cut deep into our development policy? Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I can tell the honourable gentleman that our programme budget for the FCDO is actually going to be in 2025 to 2026 at its highest level in recent years. We're able to deliver that because this government is taking action on the issues that the previous government did not tackle, in particular the in-donor refugee costs that have eaten into that budget. We saw just gimmicks, we did not see action. Instead, the new government is taking action.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The humanitarian crisis in Sudan is horrific, and it's clear that rape is being used as a weapon of war. Recent data from MSF highlights that 90% of sexual violence survivors in a hospital in Chad were abused by armed perpetrators. 50% were attacked in their homes. This is happening in 2024. So can the Foreign Secretary provide details on how the UK's recent pledges on humanitarian aid for Sudan and the region are being utilised to support survivors of sexual and gender-based violence?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising that incredibly concerning situation, and the UK has been determined to do all that we can, particularly in relation to conflict-related sexual violence. In October 2024, it was the UK that led moves to secure the renewal of the mandate of the fact-finding mission at the UN Human Rights Council. As just mentioned, we recently doubled humanitarian aid, and the Foreign Secretary also led efforts at the UN Security Council to take action on the humanitarian emergency in Sudan.
Welcoming Andrew Rossendale, the Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government appears to be in a complete tailspin over whether it will release the costs that will fall to the British taxpayer as a result of the rush deal to give away the British Chagos Islands. Given the reported trip by the Special Envoy Jonathan Powell to Mauritius, can the Minister at least confirm today which budget these costs will come from, including whether they intend to use the aid budget, tell the House how much it will cost each year and in total, and if the British Chagossians will actually have a genuine say? But, Mr Speaker, would it not make more sense to keep these strategically important islands under the Crown rather than the secretive deal negotiated? No deal is better than a bad deal.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, my understanding is there was actually 10 rounds of negotiations under the Conservatives, that we did not see the UK reaching the agreement necessary. This is a bizarre argument, frankly, coming from the opposition. All the details of this situation are in the public domain, quite rightly so, and this is part of the UK ensuring that we follow international law.
Question 4, Mr Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
We're committed to securing consular access and release of Mr El Fattah. We continue to raise, Mr Speaker, Mr El Fattah's case at the highest levels with the Egyptian government. The Prime Minister raised this with President Sisi on the 8th of August, and I last raised it with the Egyptian Foreign Minister yesterday.
Brian Lishman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the Foreign Secretary for his answer. Ala Abdel Fattah's mother, Leila Souif, is in the gallery with us today on the 58th day of her hunger strike in protest of the continued imprisonment of her son, a British citizen whose prison sentence in Egypt ended in September. I'm sure the Foreign Secretary feels the same as me and understands that Leila wants to know that her government is doing everything it can to bring her son home. Will the Foreign Secretary guarantee that the UK government will put a hold on any new economic or financial partnerships with Egypt unless and until British national Ala Abdel Fattah is freed?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I look forward to meeting Mrs Al Fattah later on today, and I want to reassure him personally that I share his determination and resolve to see Allah reunited with his family, and their love and dedication to him, I think, is obvious to many parliamentarians who they have met and campaigned with over this last period. He will understand that with the terrible situation in Gaza, it is important that this government continues to speak to our Egyptian friends who have obviously real proximity to Gaza particularly. But I understand the strength of feeling, and that's why the Prime Minister's raised this. I have raised this on successive occasions, and we will continue to lobby. He's a dual national. We will continue to lobby on his behalf.
Duncan-Smith.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, thank you for that. Can I, pursuant to this, and also that I fully support the call for his release, but also in the same area, in the UAE, Ryan Cornelius spent 16 years, much of it in solitary confinement, illegally held by the UAE. Can I ask, when the Secretary of State says he will pursue these things rigorously, when he went to the UAE recently, he didn't raise the case of Brian Cornelius with the UAE?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I reassure the right honourable gentleman, the situation of Ryan Cornelius has been raised with UAE, and officials continue to provide consular access to Mr Cornelius and Mr Ridgely, and are in contact with their families at this time. It is a serious case. We're absolutely aware of it, and UAE know we're very concerned.
John MacDonald.
I can completely understand and appreciate what the Foreign Secretary has said with regard to maintaining a relationship with Egypt because of the issue in Gaza. But the reality is this family has suffered enough. And the reality is also that President Sisi will only move if there is an economic threat. And therefore, could I ask him that after he meets the family tomorrow, that he actually contacts the President's office to make it absolutely clear that our economic relationship will suffer unless this British citizen is released.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, he should be reassured that I spoke to the Egyptian Foreign Minister yesterday. I said to him that I was meeting Mrs Al-Fattah today. I urged him to look at what parliamentarians are saying about this case. It's of huge concern, and I pressed him to do more. We have continued to do that with the Egyptians. It's obviously sensitive because of the situation in Gaza, but I don't think they're under any doubt how seriously this is taken by the British system, the government and this Parliament.
Brendan O'Hara.
Speaker, the APPG on arbitrary detention and hostage affairs has been hearing evidence from UK nationals who are being or who have been detained, and we were privileged to hear from Allah's mother just this morning. An oft-repeated concern is that if you are a UK national and you find yourself in this awful situation, you're essentially on your own when compared to other nationals. Does the Minister recognise that depiction? And if he doesn't, what could he point to as being a unique advantage of having a British passport for someone who finds himself arbitrarily detained?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr Speaker, I recognise that the honourable gentleman has got some problem with having a British passport, but I haven't got a problem with having a British passport, Mr Speaker. I'm proud to be a citizen of this great country, and let me say that we've got some outstanding diplomats and officials in FCDO. We did recognise, of course, in opposition, that there are issues in this area. That's why we've said we'll come forward with a special representative to work with hostage families.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Allah's friends and family, whom I have the privilege to represent as my local constituents, just want their brother, their uncle, their son home safe. Now, previously, the Foreign Secretary, who I know has worked hard on this issue, and as he says, has raised it with the Egyptians, has talked about what we could do if the Egyptians won't restore consular access. They still have not done so. So could the Foreign Secretary update us? I know this House speaks as one in standing and demanding that Allah be freed and able to come home to his family for this Christmas. But what more can he do and will he do if the Egyptians won't restore consular access to the family?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, look, I know that my right honourable friend has campaigned diligently on the family's behalf. She will know that the Egyptians do not accept his dual nationality. That is an issue between us. It's for that reason that they deny consular access. Currently, that access is through his lawyer. I am urging them to understand that he got that citizenship in the usual way, just like other members of his family. There was no conspiracy on behalf of the state in the way that he got that citizenship, and I continue to press them on that very issue, which would allow him to have the consular access that he deserves.
Jim Shah. Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State very much for that answer, and can I commend the Honourable Gentleman for Alloa and Greensmouth for bringing this forward as well. Yeah. It's not the only case the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman for Chingford and Woodford Green referred to. I would think of Jimmy Lai as a third one. Their UK and British passport has to mean something, Secretary of State. With that in mind, is it not time to set aside a section within the FCDO that specifically looks at these cases, tasked with getting our British citizens back home to this United Kingdom? Thank you.
Well, as the Honourable Gentleman mentions Jimmy Lai, let me just say once again that we call on the Hong Kong authorities to immediately release British national Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai is a significant priority for this government. That is why the Prime Minister raised it with the President of China just last week, and it's why I raised it with the Foreign Minister of China as well. He's right. This does need a close look by this new government. We're just over 4 months old. We are looking at it, and we will come forward with proposals shortly.
John Lammy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 5.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ensuring the safe release of all hostages, including British national Emily Damari and 3 other hostages with strong UK links, remains a top priority for this government. We support efforts of negotiators and call on the parties to return to negotiations. We continue to work alongside allies and partners in the region towards hostage releases. Negotiations remain the best chance to get hostages cruelly detained by Hamas home to their loved ones. I relayed these points to the Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister yesterday.
Thank you. Well, the horrors that have been endured by the 97 Israelis and foreign nationals held hostage by Hamas terrorists in Gaza for over 13 months are unthinkable. Given the efforts to secure the release have not yet been successful, what further steps is the United Kingdom taking to bring home Emily Damari, a 28-year-old British citizen, and the rest of the captives?
Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House joins with me in saying to those families that we, both as a House and as a government, will do absolutely everything that we can. The horrors of being a hostage family are unbearable, and we have them in our mind each and every day. We are disappointed to see that talks to secure hostage releases appear to have stalled for the moment. We are urging all parties to return to the table. A deal remains the best prospect, and we hope to work with our allies in order to see that come through.
Ollie Billington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Security Council on Friday failed to adopt a text put forward by its 10 elected members that called for an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and demanded the release of all hostages on account of a negative vote cast by a permanent member. That is extremely disappointing, condemning thousands of people in the Middle East to ongoing conflict and moving no further forward to securing the release of the hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. However, I and many of my constituents welcome the fact that the UK voted for this resolution. What will the Minister's next steps be in securing greater global agreement on securing peace, a ceasefire and the release of the hostages?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government will continue to do everything that we can to press for ceasefire, the release of all hostages and a reduction in violence in the Middle East. The Foreign Secretary discussed these matters in the G7. I discussed them with my Israeli counterpart yesterday, and we will continue to take all steps across a wide range of different conversations in order to try and advance the ceasefire that we so desperately need.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week I spoke with Mandy Demery, and I know the Minister has mentioned Emily, and in fact the Foreign Secretary and his team have been in touch with the family as well. It's obvious that she and so many other hostage families are going through the most unimaginable suffering. So can the Minister, I think if I may on behalf of the Foreign Secretary, confirm as to whether any aid organisations have had any humanitarian access to these hostages? And if not, what kind of pressure is being exerted on these agencies? Because one of the clear things that we are hearing is that welfare concerns absolutely are paramount, but also these poor families are suffering such unimaginable horrors and concerns. And importantly, our aid budget needs to be spent in the right way. So can he just tell us what work is being undertaken on this?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Regrettably, no organisation has had access to the hostages. We continue to call for access for ICRC and any other appropriate NGO in the usual way. Let us be clear, Hamas hold these hostages. They are behaving abominably, out with any international norm. They are not avoiding by any convention that you could possibly think of. We will continue to press them to ensure that British nationals get the access that they require. But this is very regrettable for the whole House that we're in this position.
James McCleary.
Question number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary attended the EU Foreign Affairs Council on the 14th of October, and in the margins he agreed with EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs Borrell to work towards a security partnership and committed to 6 monthly foreign policy dialogues starting in early 2025. And yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I met with EAS Secretary General Sonino to discuss some of our vital shared interests, including Ukraine, hybrid threats and the Western Balkans, alongside ministerial colleagues.
James McCleary.
I thank the Minister for his answer. President-elect Trump's confirmation of tariffs on Canada, one of the US's closest allies, raises serious concerns about the willingness to honour the US-UK special relationship. If this is the future of US relations with their closest partners, does the Minister agree that closer cooperation with the EU on defence and trade are now urgently needed, including access to the European Customs Union and a defence pact with the EU going beyond the recent agreement with Germany?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and we of course have a thriving trading and investment relationship with the United States, with more than 1 million British citizens working for US firms and vice versa, and we look forward to working with President-elect Trump in office, including on his policy priorities, and to improve our trading relations. Our need to work together in Europe on security issues, I think, is absolutely clear to all members of this House, whether it's the threat from Russia, the war in Ukraine, the hybrid threats, the situation in Moldova, the situation in the Western Balkans, and that's exactly what we're getting on with and doing.
Bill Brittle.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the recent announcement of the UK-Germany bilateral defence agreement, which was signed at record-breaking pace by the new government at Trinity House last month. This will bolster closer working with Europe's largest economy on wider defence and security matters at a time of increasing Russian aggression across Europe. With this in mind, can the Minister therefore explain to the House how the Trinity House agreement fits into wider discussions with EU and NATO counterparts around defence and security?
Well, I thank the honourable friend for his remarks on that important treaty work that we're doing. I know he takes a keen interest in matters relating to UK-German relations. We continue to engage with German colleagues from across the spectrum. We're keen to get this treaty agreed as soon as possible. And for me, this very naturally fits with both our NATO membership and that new enhanced dialogue that we have with the EU on security and defence matters.
Stephen Liddon.
Number 7, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll answer questions 7 and 9 together. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic. The UK's recent vote for the UN Security Council resolution on Gaza has already been mentioned. It called for a huge scale-up in aid across Gaza. We need that aid access, and restrictions on aid are unacceptable.
Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The International Development Committee recently heard testimony from Nazam Mahmoud, a surgeon recently returned from the Nasser hospital in Gaza, describing Israeli drones picking off injured children after bombings. His account echoed an October New York Times report which cited 44 doctors, nurses and paramedics who witnessed numerous cases of prepubescent children shot in the head or chest during the ongoing conflict in Gaza. What steps is the government taking to prevent a genocide in Gaza?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We've heard a number of deeply concerning reports about developments in Gaza. I know that has also been the case for the Select Committee, as mentioned. The UK Government's position could not be clearer. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be held to, and that particularly, of course, also covers the operations of healthcare workers. We pay tribute to them operating in such difficult circumstances.
David Smith.
Mr Speaker, as we've been hearing, the situation in Gaza, especially northern Gaza, is dire, with the UN anticipating that up to 60,000 children under the age of 5 this year could be facing acute malnutrition, at the same time when the trucks entering Gaza have reduced by 63% since October 23. Now, I welcome the leading role that the government is taking in providing vital humanitarian aid for Gaza, but does the Minister agree with me that the ongoing Israeli restrictions on the flow of essential aid are completely unacceptable and should be lifted immediately?
Minister.
Yes, Mr Speaker, and we're seeing a very disturbing impact from those restrictions. We've seen it in the famine assessment, in the levels of malnutrition and ill health now prevalent in Gaza. Winter, of course, is now upon us, making that situation even worse. Those restrictions on aid are unacceptable. They must be lifted immediately.
To Andrew Morrison.
When the Foreign Secretary was in Baku recently for COP29, Mr Speaker, did he discuss with his interlocutors across the region the extent to which the global finance goals will be impacting on humanitarian assistance in the Middle East?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yes, the Foreign Secretary did discuss those matters, including directly with Maya Motley, who of course is the Premier of Barbados, who has been leading many of the small island developing states on these issues. Certainly for the UK, we're determined to make sure that we play our part on humanitarian issues as well as globally on climate issues. That's so important for our own country as well as the rest of the world.
Calum.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I asked the Foreign Secretary some weeks ago about getting assurances that children receiving polio vaccinations will not be killed after receiving these vaccinations. Since that assurance, thousands of children have been killed in northern Gaza. My question is this. Given the ICC's ruling recently about war crimes, the British public no doubt wants to know, why is this government shying away from its legal and moral obligations of banning all arms and all trade?
Hear, hear.
Minister.
The UK Government has been determined to use every mechanism to advance international humanitarian law. That includes within the UN Security Council, as we've just been discussing, Mr Speaker, but also we've been taking action at every bilateral and multilateral opportunity. Most recently, of course, I mentioned the UN Security Council, but also in issues around polio too, where the UK led those efforts to get vaccination going in the first place. Thank you.
Chair of the Development Committee, Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In October, the Israeli Knesset passed 2 laws relating to UNRWA, the law for the cessation of UNRWA activities in the State of Israel and the law for cessation of UNRWA activities. These will take effect on the 28th of January, and the consequence will be preventing aid distribution in Gaza and the prevention of both primary care, education and indeed refuge collection in the West Bank. Last week, my committee was in Palestine and Jordan. There is huge concern that if this legislation does take effect, it will breach numerous international laws and will have a catastrophic effect on the humanitarian and security situation in the region. So can the Foreign Secretary detail what conversations she's had with the Israeli counterparts to prevent this implementation, and what you're doing with the international community to protect a UN organisation?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for raising this important issue, and indeed for her committee for the work that they have engaged in on this subject. The UK Government has been absolutely clear. UNRWA is the only agency that can deliver aid at the scale and depth that is required in the middle of this humanitarian emergency. She asked about the representations being made by the UK Government. I have made those representations myself, including at the UN General Assembly. The Minister for Middle East and North Africa has made those representations yesterday. The Foreign Secretary has made them a number of times, including to his Israeli counterparts. It's very clear those restrictions on operation of UNRWA must not be implemented by the Israeli Government.
Richard Ford.
Mr Speaker,
The humanitarian situation in the Middle East is made worse by arms supplied from within and beyond the region. The Liberal Democrats have a long-standing policy that the UK government should not be exporting arms to Israel or to the occupied Palestinian territories, given that they were referred to in the FCDO's last human rights report. Will the FCDO extend the number of arms export licences that are denied to Israel by the UK?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would gently encourage the honourable member to look at the action that was taken by the UK government a number of weeks ago now, Mr Speaker, which was to suspend a number of arms licences. We believe that was important because of that risk towards breaking international humanitarian law. This UK government takes its responsibilities in that regard very seriously indeed.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
The root cause of so much of the terrible humanitarian suffering we see in the Middle East today is the regime in Tehran, fueling the Houthis, Hamas and Hezbollah, and brutally repressing its own people, while also bailing out Putin's war machine and even plotting to assassinate individuals based here in the UK. Now, beyond sanctions with Iran, which we all support and successive governments have put in place over the years, can I ask the Minister, on behalf of the Foreign Secretary, what exactly is the comprehensive plan now to start dealing with this repressive regime that is causing so much brutality across the Middle East?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are deeply concerned about the destabilising impact of the Iranian regime within the region and indeed beyond it. The Right Honourable Lady mentioned a number of cases where we can see that impact very clearly. I would also underline, Mr Speaker, that the truly devastating humanitarian crisis that we're seeing presently in Yemen is very much connected to Iranian backing for the Houthis. We have repeatedly raised our concerns around this bilaterally and multilaterally. We are very clear that we have to have a very strong voice as a UK government on these matters, and that's exactly what we're delivering.
Question 8, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Echo 2 telephone contract for telephones in the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office is 79% completed, but is on track for a completion in January 2025. Ministers and officials have been working day and night to fix the procurement mistakes of the government which went before.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Echo 2 programme is crucial for delivering the new global communications network for the FCDO. You mentioned it's due for completion in January 2025. Will it remain within budget? What are the plans to ensure it delivers its full technical and financial benefits? And does the Minister see any additional support or adjustments that will be needed in order to ensure its delivery?
Minister.
With increased scrutiny and hard-working ministers and officials, we will reach all targets, and I will write to him with more detail on his specific question.
Chris Curtis.
Question number 11, Mr Speaker.
Minister. Oh, Foreign.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I'll answer questions 11 and 14 together. I was proud to join ministers across government in showing UK leadership on the climate and nature crisis at COP29. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, announced our ambitious 2035 emissions reduction target. I reaffirmed our commitment to the Global South through £11.6 billion in climate finance.
Chris Curtis.
Thank you. At COP29, under a Labour government, the UK reclaimed its position as a global leader on climate action. We recognise now that our security and prosperity hinge on addressing this crisis. Would my right honourable friend join me in welcoming the progress made on climate finance, whilst acknowledging that there is much more to do to keep us on track with that roadmap and to keep 1.5 degrees alive?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question? I do think it was important that our Prime Minister was the only G7 Prime Minister to attend COP, and he will recall that last year the Prime Minister at the time did not attend. It's hugely important that we reach the £300 billion for climate finance. It will help the Global South get there on clean energy, and of course we hope that our global clean energy power alliance will be able to work with them, and they've got the money now to do it.
Laura Coates-Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The world's forests are the lungs of the earth, but we are losing them at an alarming rate. An area the size of Azerbaijan, where COP29 was hosted, is being destroyed every year. Can the Foreign Secretary explain what the government is doing to preserve the world's forests and to support those who protect them?
I was very pleased to speak at COP on the issue of forests and to join inspirational Indigenous leaders on that subject. And it's why we found $3 billion for nature, of which $1.5 billion is dedicated to work on forests.
Number 12, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, ahead of the elections on 11th of October, I expressed my concerns directly to Foreign Minister Darchashvili regarding pressure on civil society and stigmatisation of minorities ahead of the parliamentary elections. And following the elections, I publicly expressed support for the OSCE's preliminary findings in relation to the election, and I called on the Georgian authorities to investigate all irregularities and reverse their declining commitment to an inclusive and open democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his actions on this. I draw the House's attention to my register of interest in the work I've done in the past with democratic activists in Georgia. Those activists are terrified that Georgia is now at a turning point. So I wonder if the Minister will join me in calling for new elections under international oversight, an end to the attacks on civil society groups, especially the heroic LGBT groups who are under attack there. And if those things don't take place, whether the government will keep open the option of sanctions on those individuals who are responsible for the democratic backsliding in Georgia.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I recognise my honourable friend's long-standing interest in this issue and his strong views on it. Let me be clear that on the 28th of October, His Majesty's Ambassador to Georgia called on the Central Election Commission to transparently investigate all alleged instances of election fraud. And following the session of the new Parliament meeting, the Embassy again reiterated our concerns about election violations and the need for independent investigation. He is absolutely right. The right to peaceful protest and free civil society is a key attribute of any modern European democracy and must be respected, and we will continue to make this clear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I first of all pay tribute to the honourable member for East Renfrewshire, whose focus on Georgia has been incredibly important, not just to the free elections in Georgia, but actually to the spread of Putin's evil influence across Europe. May I ask the Minister what actions he's taking to push back on Russia's influence in the region and actually push back into Russia itself, using the budget he has on the BBC World Service to broadcast in subnational languages inside Russia so that the people of Russia know what is being done in their name and they can understand what Putin is doing to them.
Minister.
Well, the right honourable gentleman, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely right to point to the important work the BBC World Service does in this area, particularly its language services. And I've met their fantastic staff in the past who do this important work. It's important that people have access to free, accurate and impartial information, including in their own languages. But we've been clear about the extent of Russian interference in Georgia for a long time. We're clear about their interference across Europe and in democracies. That's why we're working so closely with NATO and indeed EU partners on this very issue.
Gerald Mayo.
Number 13, sir.
Minister.
The United States is an indispensable ally, and I'm committed to the depth and breadth of the UK-US relationship. The Prime Minister and I met with President-elect Trump in September for dinner. It was a good opportunity to get to know each other, and of course we continue to work with the current administration. I was with Tony Blinken just yesterday.
Mr. Speaker, defence spending is a key aspect of our relationship with the United States. So will the Foreign Secretary be able to tell our American allies the date on which we're going to increase defence spending to 2.5%? And if he cannot, what influence will we have on European allies to increase their defence spending?
Foreign Secretary.
The honourable gentleman's right to raise the issue of defence spending. It's been raised by US Presidents since Eisenhower. And he's right that when Donald Trump came to power, there were just 4 European countries spending above 2%. When we left government, it was 2.5%. We're sad that it dropped, and we're determined to get it back to 2.5% of GDP.
Let's come to topicals with Richard.
Topical number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
In the past month, growth was at the heart of my visit to Africa, We agreed work on a new global plan in South Africa and a new strategic partnership with Nigeria. During our UN Security Council presidency, we've shown support for Ukraine 1,000 days into the war and pressed for a lasting peace in the Middle East, and I condemned Russia's shameful veto of a resolution on Sudan. Finally, throughout COP, we've been restoring British leadership on climate.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Since coming to office, this government has suspended arms export licences to Israel, rolled over on the ICC with nothing new against Hamas terrorists, poured cash into UNRWA despite concerns over Hamas double-hatting a significant number of the UNRWA staff. Many of these have been published in Arabic on the UK government's website, Mr. Speaker. So I've got a couple of questions. Who decides what should be published in Arabic? Why are they being published in Arabic? And as they relate to Israel, why is nothing being published in Hebrew?
Foreign Secretary.
The art of diplomacy is speaking to foreign leaders, foreign nations, as best we can in the UK national interest. Sometimes that does involve foreign languages. That's why, for example, we support the BBC World Service. It was a slightly bizarre question.
Sean Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We can all agree that ending human trafficking across the English Channel requires a coordinated approach with all the countries that people are being trafficked from. Can the Foreign Secretary or one of the ministers assure the House that the French government shares our commitment to smashing the gangs and ending these crossings?
Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend will be pleased, Mr. Speaker, that I met with the French Foreign Minister just last week in London and discussed these issues, and we agreed to coordinate together. And of course, the Home Secretary is working very closely with the new Interior Minister of France.
Foreign Secretary, Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the relationship the government is building with China appears to be all give and no take. So in order to convince the House this is a different situation, can the Foreign Secretary state, since his recent visits to China and his future visits to China, what has been achieved with regard to advancing Britain's interests on security, economic practices and on human rights?
Secretary.
Can I welcome the Honourable Lady to her place and remind her that under the last government there were about 7 different China policies and very little was achieved. We've had 4.5 months and I was very pleased to be in China discussing issues on which we disagree, agree and on which we challenge China, and will continue to do that over the coming months and years.
Dame Prince Patel.
Speaker, in light of his response, can the Foreign Secretary categorically state that in his conversations with Chinese counterparts, has the UK government explicitly called for the national security law in Hong Kong to be repealed, and has he specifically called for Jimmy Lai to be released, and will he ensure that no deals such as the application for the Chinese embassy go ahead until Jimmy Lai is free?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for raising the situation in Hong Kong. It was a substantial part of our conversation. Of course, we raised issues around Jimmy Lai, which I've said in the House before, and of course the security law in Hong Kong. There are disagreements between us. We were very, very clear about that. And she can be sure that on issues of our representation, both in this country and their representation, these are matters that will pass through our system in the usual way without government interference.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's nearly 8 months now since an IDF attack on a World Central Kitchen convoy killed 7 aid workers, including 3 Britons, James Henderson, John Chapman and James Kirby. So does the Foreign Secretary agree that their families deserve to see accountability and justice for their deaths?
Foreign Secretary.
I'm very grateful for the question. It was very important for me to meet with the families a few weeks ago. The killing of 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers, including those British nationals, in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza on the 1st of April was appalling and a matter of great concern. It was important for me to meet with the families, and we continue to urge the Advocate General in Israel to proceed with a proper investigation and inquiry, and to get on with that as quickly as possible.
Democrat spokesperson Calum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's announcement that the UK will sanction Russia's so-called shadow fleet. Yet I understand the UK has not levied a single fine for breaching the existing sanctions on Russia's oil. Will the Foreign Secretary and Chancellor now take more robust action to ensure that UK sanctions are complied with?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I was very pleased to see President Zelensky just yesterday recognising UK leadership on challenging the shadow fleet, and I've made this part of my personal mission, which he will know, a record number of oil tankers. We're leading the world in sanctioning the shadow fleet. He's also right to say that there are issues around enforcement, and that's why we've instigated a review.
But
Speaker, last month I met with the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom, General Zaluzhny, where he raised the importance of ensuring Ukrainian children and young people forced to flee this terrible conflict in their own country get the support and education they need so they can be the generation that rebuilds Ukraine. Can the Foreign Secretary tell me what conversations he's had with the Ukrainian government and his ministerial colleagues to ensure that this is the case?
Foreign Secretary.
He raises a very important issue. I met with the Ukrainian children a few months ago in Ukraine who had been taken to Russia and fortunately brought back to Ukraine by an NGO that we were supporting. We've increased our funds for this important work, both in Ukraine and in Moldova, where I was last week.
James McCleary.
Mr. Speaker, the EU has been very clear that they welcome a new youth mobility scheme with the UK. As the Minister knows, this would not be a return to freedom of movement and could be agreed separately from the trade and cooperation agreement the UK signed when we left the EU. So can the Minister tell me, this House and the young people of this country, why the government will not sit down with European allies to agree a new youth mobility scheme?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're engaged in a number of conversations with our EU counterparts at the moment, my colleague in the Cabinet Office and myself and the Foreign Secretary and others, but I'm not going to give a running commentary on this. We will look at EU proposals on a range of issues, but there are no plans for a youth mobility scheme, nor will we return to freedom of movement.
Mike up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is vital that we continue to supply Ukraine with aid in the face of Russian aggression. Minister, is this combined with diplomatic efforts to bring about a just and lasting peace in line with UN conventions?
Who wants it? Somebody wants it, please.
Mr. Speaker, our support is absolutely absolute and resolute. I'm very happy to meet the honourable member to discuss these issues further, and we will continue in that position.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Will the Foreign Secretary take every opportunity to impress on the incoming President the vital importance of the Article 5 guarantee, whereby the United States would come to the aid of any NATO country which was attacked? And will he impress on President Trump that we will do everything that we can to encourage other NATO allies to contribute more to the costs of defence?
Yes, 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 and more yes, and thank you to the Right Honourable Gentleman for highlighting this very, very important issue. The NATO alliance is the strongest and best alliance that the modern world has seen, and of course the UK will continue to impress that point on anyone who will listen.
Raim Downey.
With the upcoming audit into the UK's relationship with China, how does the Foreign Secretary plan to strike a balance between economic growth and growing security concerns with China's dominance in critical national infrastructure, including Chinese-made IoT modules?
Very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for raising this question. It was important in coming to government that we conducted a China audit right across Whitehall to look at the range of relationships. Underpinning that are the 3 Cs, that we will cooperate with China where we can, we will compete with China where we should, and we will challenge China where we must.
Cleverly.
What conversations did the Foreign Secretary have with the Defence Secretary about the diplomatic implications of scrapping key military capabilities such as HMS Albion and Bulwark, and a failure to set a timeline for 2.5% of defence spending?
Secretary.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman knows I've got huge respect for him. But can I just say, on the issue of defence spending, that's a little bit rich, given the drop that we saw under the last government. The Prime Minister just last week indicated that we'll set that out in due course. I'm pleased that the Defence Secretary, in coming to power, set about a strategic defence review, which is something that should have been done, frankly, under the last government.
Trina Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that Iran's support for the Russia's war in Ukraine is a direct threat to Europe's security, and can he outline what steps he has taken to respond?
Well, I'm very grateful for the question. We are deeply concerned by Iran's malign behaviour. The transfer of ballistic missiles to Ukraine was escalatory. That's why I sanctioned Iran Air. That's why I've sanctioned Iran shipping. I will continue to speak to the Foreign Minister in Iran about these issues, and clearly we are very concerned about any attempts by Iran to get nuclear capability.
Stephen Gathins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Scotland's international brand is used to boost our economy throughout the world, selling Scottish products and experiences and boost our soft power. So can the Foreign Secretary tell us, how's his department marking St Andrew's Day on Saturday?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to be able to take this question as one of many Scots in the House. We're incredibly proud of Brand Scotland. Our Scottish Secretary has been driving that forward, really pushing the case for Scotland's place in the world, working as part of the UK, and we will most certainly be celebrating it. Certainly I will. Thank you.
Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Action for Humanity research conducted within Gaza revealed that 53% of respondents already received no humanitarian aid during so-called evacuations. And there are fears that the Knesset's vote to sever ties with UNRWA is likely to reduce access to aid even further. The Minister's already referenced representations that have been made, but what specific immediate actions will the Secretary undertake to reinforce the UN's multilateral framework and the Israeli government's obligations under international law to ensure that sufficient aid reaches civilians in Gaza?
I've got to get colleagues in. These are topicals. They're meant to be short and punchy. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We absolutely recognise the impact of sometimes repeated displacements on the population, up to 9 times in some cases. We've used every opportunity to make clear the essential role of UN, including UNRWA, in Gaza. Thank you.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that the ICC's decision does nothing to help secure the release of hostages, deliver more aid into Gaza, or deliver a sustainable end to the war in the Middle East?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I set out to this House yesterday afternoon, the ICC is the primary method of accountability for war crimes. It should be supported across the whole House. Our support for the ICC does not limit the actions we take in relation to the other issues. We've talked about hostages already this morning, and indeed the vital importance of a ceasefire. We will continue to...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his leadership in tackling and sanctioning those aiding and abetting the illegal invasion of Ukraine? But what more can we do to tackle the wider issue of corruption and kleptocracy that defines Putin's cronies?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend, and he served on Haringey before taking up his place in this House, so we are good friends over many years. He's right to raise this issue. We said that illicit finance would be a priority. It will be a priority. I hope to make further announcements on the back of the sanctions announcements that I made this week.
Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With World AIDS Day approaching, I'm sure the whole House will agree the impact that the Global Fund has had on tackling HIV and AIDS globally. With a replenishment next year, will ministers commit to the UK continuing to make a significant contribution to the Global Fund?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, both for his question and the leadership that he has shown on this issue, as well as others across the House. The UK is determined to see successful replenishments for all of the health-related funds, and we just announced, for example, with the WHO, that we were definitely going to do that just this week. Thank you.
Liz MacDonald.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Innovation plays a key role in tackling hunger. Can the Minister expand on what efforts we are taking to tackle hunger and how we are supporting innovators like Alora, based at Norwich Research Park, who are using revolutionary technology to create the world's first ocean agriculture system?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. We have incredible facilities in Norwich working on agricultural innovation. They're important, of course, for global food production, but also very important for UK farmers, whose research is used, the research is used intensively by our local farmers as well as those globally. Thank you.
Timothy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's ridiculous that Britain should even contemplate taking some of the 61 Sri Lankan asylum seekers on Diego Garcia as part of its agreement with Mauritius. There are serious concerns in Whitehall that some of those Sri Lankans have criminal records. There are allegations that some of them may be involved in child abuse. I've raised this with the Home Office to no avail. Can ministers in the Foreign Office make sure that all records are checked in Sri Lanka and in Diego Garcia and make sure that no such criminals or abusers are allowed to Britain?
Can shorten up.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The government inherited a situation involving Tamil migrants from India and Sri Lanka who arrived there. We're delivering a solution that protects migrants' welfare but avoids opening a new dangerous migration route, and very much the concerns he raised in relation to safeguarding and any other issues are absolutely at the heart of that and are being dealt with by Home Office and other ministerial colleagues.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My right honourable friend will share my concern at the increasing number of women being given death sentences by the Iranian authorities. What urgent representations will my right honourable friend make to the Iranian government to overturn these death sentences and ensure women receive a fair trial?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I can assure my honourable friend that Her Majesty's Ambassador to Iran will continue to raise this appalling issue directly with Iranian officials in Tehran. Furthermore, the UK was instrumental in the delivery of the Iran Human Rights Resolution, which was adopted last week at the UN Third Committee, which called on Iran to establish a moratorium on executions and to end reprisals against women human rights defenders.
Africa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government has indicated that it would arrest the democratically elected Prime Minister of Israel. Doing so would be a contradiction of an act of Parliament and a breach of state and diplomatic immunity. Can the Foreign Secretary tell the House whether he believes compliance with the ICC decision is setting a precedent for future decisions of a similar nature, and is he not concerned that he is contradicting international norms?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, we dealt with this question at some exhaustive length yesterday, so let me repeat the answer. The Shadow Attorney General has written on the question, Mr Speaker, of which elements of international law are most properly followed in this case, and the Attorney General has set out to respond, though we would suspect that this would be a case that would go to the courts in the usual way.
My constituent, the British citizen Jimmy Lai, is in failing health now. And can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his work and all of the work of his department in upholding his rights under international law? Can the Foreign Secretary share with us his assessment of the scale of international support for the release of Jimmy Lai?
Foreign Secretary.
Massive is probably the word that I would put. In America, it's being raised right across the European Union. It's being raised, and of course we are raising it. His trial has begun. He's now well into his 70s, and that's why I made the case to the Chinese that he should be released. This is becoming cruel and unusual punishment, frankly.
Senator Allenco.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The International Criminal Court have confirmed what we have all known for months, that the Israeli government, under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, has unleashed a concerted campaign of crimes against humanity on innocent Palestinian civilians. This is no longer a question of which side you are on, of who is right and wrong. It is cold, hard legal facts, and we cannot allow it. Can the Secretary of State assure us that the government is considering appropriate action against Netanyahu and Gallant to properly hold them to account?
Minister, too long.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can assure my honourable friend that the UK government intends to stand by its international obligations in relation to the ICC and in relation to many other things as well.
Jim Bergen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. After the issuing of the arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, can the Foreign Secretary confirm when will the government impose the scale of sanctions on Israel, not just individuals, that the government rightly imposed on Russia after the ICC arrest warrant against Putin? Because a war crime is a war crime, and arrest warrants and arrest warrants, all lives are equal. We must ensure there can be no accusations of double standards.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I hope it has been clear since we became the government in July how important questions of international law are to us, how soberly we treat these issues and how we ensure that in all matters, including in relation to the ICC cases that my honourable friend describes, that we follow due process, and that is what we intend to do in relation to the ICC.
Final question, Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The civil war in Sudan is estimated to have killed around 150,000 people and displaced 14 million. UNICEF and the UN World Food Programme say that unless efforts are stepped up, more than 70,000 children are projected to suffer acute malnutrition. So can the Minister tell us what steps the UK is taking as the UN penholder to end this malnutrition and support the Sudanese?
Minister.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. Very recently, the Foreign Secretary co-led a resolution on the protection of civilians in Sudan. Unfortunately, despite 14 votes in favour, Russia vetoed that resolution. We will continue to push on these issues, and we have doubled our aid to Sudan because of the dreadful crisis there. Thank you.
Completes question. Point of order, Stephen Gettin.
Thank you for granting this point of order, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, earlier on, my honourable friend, the member for Argyll and Butes, raised a very serious case of the detention of Ala Abdel Fattah, whose family are with us in the chamber today. When he raised the case of this British passport holder, the Foreign Secretary told the member that he has a problem with having a British passport. Now, there are members in this House who have got very different views about the constitutional future of this country, be they from Scotland, Ireland or Wales. But will, Mr Speaker, you reassure me and my colleagues that regardless of our views about the future, everybody who holds a British passport has the right to be stuck up for by their Member of Parliament?
I don't know whether the Foreign Secretary wants to just answer quickly.
Well, I confirm, of course, everybody with a British passport has the right to representation. I would hope that we're the kind of country that supports all sorts of people in trouble, whatever their background, who are in our country.
Right, let us move on. Let the front benches change over.